The hearth fire crackled low in the belly of the longhouse. Its flickering light cast restless shadows on timbered walls, dancing over carved beams worn smooth by generations of hands. The scent of smoke and damp earth mingled with something older, the faint, almost imperceptible aroma of dried herbs crushed beneath a mortar, of cured roots forgotten on wooden shelves, of salt lingering in old wool cloaks. Outside, the northern wind howled across the fjord, rattling the thatched roof like an ancient voice trying to be heard. The villagers had retreated inward, not just from the cold, but from the dark. Within the longhouse, warmth clung close to skin and fur, and memories settled like dust over every surface. In the far end of the house, near the low hearth where the embers glowed like slumbering eyes, sat an old woman. Her hair, once fire-red, now streaked with ash, was bound in a simple braid. She wore sealskin over wool, and in her lap rested a bundle wrapped in reindeer hide. Not treasure, not weapon, but something older still. With steady hands, she unwrapped the bundle, revealing a tangle of dried roots, dark leaves, and brittle stalks. Angelica, Skirwite, fat hen, names no longer spoken in the village. Plants that had once fed the people, healed their wounds, even whispered to their gods. She held one to her nose and breathed in. The young ones no longer knew these scents. Once, these herbs and roots had been common companions gathered from forest glades, tended in kitchen plots, traded across valleys. They were the lifeblood of Viking survival, and not just for hunger's sake. These plants carried meanings: sacred, dangerous, forbidden. Some were used to nourish, others to protect, a few only to destroy. But time more than sword or storm is the great eraser. The foods that shaped the Norse world, that nourished gods and kings and thralls alike, were now forgotten by all but the wind. They had vanished not only from the table but from the mind, replaced, abandoned, forbidden. How could this happen? How could a people so intimately tied to the land, who wrung life from frost-bitten earth and salt-soaked shores, lose track of what once sustained them? How could Angelica, the sacred stalk of the gods, become a roadside weed? Or Skirwite, once a winter root of healing, be unknown even to herbalists? How could the sea harvest, the coastal greens, the fermented roots, the blood-fed stews all disappear as if they had never mattered? The answer lies not in one moment, but in many. In the slow shift of seasons and beliefs. In the arrival of foreign traders bearing cinnamon and saffron. In the stern warnings of Christian priests who called old foods unclean. In the black iron teeth of industrial plows that tore up ancient meadows in favor of wheat and barley. And in silence. The silence of old women like her, who held the knowledge but found no daughters to pass it to. Who watched as sacred mushrooms were turned to superstition, as blood foods became shameful, as weeds grew in the beds where Angelica once towered 6 feet tall, not because they spread, but because the people stopped bending to harvest them. The longhouse creaked as a log shifted in the fire. The old woman stirred, eyes tracing the walls where once hung bunches of drying herbs, now bare. She remembered her mother's voice, singing to the plants as she picked them. She remembered the taste of a spring broth made from fat hen, the bitter edge of wild onion greens, the sharp sweetness of fermented sea kale. Each taste was a memory, each memory a world. But this world, their world, was slipping away. 1,000 years ago, these foods were life. Today, they are ghosts. Only traces remain: seeds in forgotten fields, whispers in sagas, fragments in the soil uncovered by modern archaeologists who stare in wonder and ask, what did these people eat? How did they survive here? What did they lose when their foods vanished? Tonight, in this story, we will summon them back. This is not merely a tale of strange vegetables and vanished meals. This is the story of how food becomes forbidden, not just by priests or kings, but by forgetfulness. It is the story of how climate, conquest, and culture can erase flavors from history. And it is a story of rediscovery, of pulling roots from the earth, not just to feed the body, but to feed the soul of a people who once knew how to eat the land itself. The old woman took one last breath of the Angelica root, then wrapped it away. The fire dimmed, the smoke rose, and outside, the stars turned slowly in their frozen dance. The land was quiet, but not silent. There are voices buried in the earth. It is time we listen. Part 2. The Viking Diet. Beyond the stereotype. The popular image of a Viking feast is vivid and familiar. Long tables groaning under the weight of roasted meat, warriors slamming down horns of mead, and firelight gleaming off the polished surfaces of axes and shields. It is a compelling vision, dramatic, primal, and heroic, but it is also wrong, or at least incomplete. In truth, the Viking diet was shaped not by abundance, but by necessity. The lands of Scandinavia, rugged, cold, and often stingy with fertility, demanded a relationship with food that was anything but decadent. Survival required intimacy with the land, mastery of seasonal cycles, and a willingness to eat whatever the gods and the earth allowed. In this context, the Norse people developed a food system that was diverse, decentralized, and astonishingly resilient, a system that has since been mostly forgotten. Step into a Viking settlement in the year 850, and the smells tell a richer tale than the sagas. The acrid tang of smoke from dried fish, the sweet, grassy aroma of mead fermenting in birch barrels, the earthy steam rising from a clay pot of root stew. There is meat, yes, but it is not the main course. It is a luxury, occasional, salted and dried for winter, or used to celebrate great events. Day to day, the Viking people ate a diet that was mostly plant-based, heavily seasonal, and locally adapted, and much of that diet has disappeared. Not merely the foods themselves, though many are now extinct, endangered, or regarded as weeds, but the knowledge of how and why they were used. What survives in sagas and archaeology is just enough to hint at a world of nourishment, both physical and spiritual, where food was not just fuel, but memory, medicine, and meaning. The Viking pantry was filled with the tough survivors of the north. Barley was the backbone of bread and porridge. Oats were consumed in thick gruels. Peas and broad beans, some native, some traded from the south, added protein when meat was scarce. Turnips and their wild cousins were boiled, mashed, or fermented into nutrient-rich winter stores. But it was the greens, the wild herbs, the bitter leaves, the overlooked perennials that formed the hidden heart of the Viking diet. Plants like fat hen, nettle, and good King Henry were gathered in spring and summer, not only for their flavor, but for their ability to prevent scurvy and replenish the body after long months of preserved food. These were the multivitamins of the Viking world, harvested by memory and instinct from meadows, forest edges, and cultivated plots. Modern archaeological digs at sites like Jorvik, modern-day York, and Hedeby have unearthed pollen traces, seed fragments, and charred food remains that tell a more nuanced tale than old Hollywood ever could. These findings reveal traces of herbs like wild chervil, caraway, thyme, and juniper berries, not just as flavorings, but as essential tools in preserving and balancing food, and even medicine. While meat was limited by availability and climate, fish was the great equalizer. Coastal and inland communities alike relied on the bounty of lakes, rivers, and fjords. Cod, herring, trout, and eel were caught in elaborate seasonal cycles and preserved in salt, smoke, or air drying. Even their heads and organs were consumed, sometimes boiled into broth, sometimes fermented into potent pastes that offered both nutrition and probiotics. The Vikings practiced forms of fermentation so complex that modern food scientists have only recently begun to understand them. Root vegetables were sometimes buried with salt and herbs to preserve them through winter. Milk was soured into skyr, a kind of proto-yogurt, rich in protein and gut-friendly bacteria. Cabbages and other greens were pickled in brine, sometimes with horseradish, mustard seed, or even ash. These preservation techniques weren't just clever, they were essential. In a land where winter lasted half the year and fresh food was rare, fermentation was a sacred art. And like all sacred things, some of its ingredients and processes were eventually deemed too pagan, too potent, or too primitive to survive into modernity. Today, we measure food by calories, convenience, and cost. But the Viking approach was different. Food was judged by its ability to keep a family alive through the hunger months, to fortify warriors for battle, to heal the sick and the old, and to bind communities together through shared labor and tradition. This is why certain foods like skirwite, a spindly, parsnip-like root, were grown not for their flavor alone, but for their power to soothe winter illnesses. Why Angelica, tall and aromatic, was chewed raw on ships to fight off scurvy. Why fat hen, today cursed as a weed, was once a vital green gathered with reverence. Each of these foods tells a story, and each was, in its own way, forbidden not by law, but by silence, forgotten because they did not fit the narrative of conquest, lost because they did not scale to modern agriculture, abandoned because their meanings were no longer understood. Modern scholars, anthropologists, and archaeobotanists are beginning to reassemble the Viking diet from the soil up, literally. In recent years, preserved latrines from Viking sites have offered microscopic glimpses of lost ingredients. Ancient seed banks are being searched for clues to the forgotten vegetables of the north. Ethnobotanists are turning to Sami traditions and coastal folk practices to trace the outlines of a cuisine that was once rich, regional, and deeply adapted to its environment. This isn't just curiosity, it is revelation, because food is the most intimate connection a people have with their land, their gods, and each other. To forget a food is to forget a way of living. To lose it is to lose a piece of the soul. And the Vikings, for all their weapons and wanderlust, were first and foremost survivors, people who knew how to eat the land, sea, and sky. The image of the meat-slamming, mead-swilling Viking makes for good cinema, but behind the warrior stood a farmer, and beside him, a healer, and above them all, the land harsh, beautiful, and giving only to those who remembered what to ask for. In the parts to come, we will descend into the root cellar of Viking memory to unearth the forbidden, the sacred, and the utterly lost. Part 3. The agricultural society behind the warrior myth. It begins with silence. Not the silence of a battlefield after the clash, nor the solemn hush before the longship launches into icy waves. This silence is older, steadier, the hush of soil warming under spring light, of morning mist curling through rye fields, of a scythe whispering through Angelica stalks grown tall near the longhouse wall. This is the true heart of Viking civilization, not the war cry, but the wheat field. Behind every raiding expedition, every saga of blood and glory, there stood another world, a quieter one, a world of labor, of land, of food grown, preserved, and consumed with care. Viking society was built not just by warriors, but by farmers, men and women who understood that strength meant nothing without sustenance, that no sword is sharp without bread to back it. Contrary to the popular image of sea-born marauders who lived for plunder and battle, the majority of Norse people in the Viking Age were not raiders at all. They were agriculturalists. They lived on small farms scattered across the coasts and valleys of Scandinavia, in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, where they cultivated the stubborn earth and wrested life from a landscape both generous and cruel. Their settlements were modest but ingenious. Longhouses, barns, pit houses, and earth cellars formed the spine of daily life. These weren't temporary dwellings for vagabond warriors, they were permanent homes for entire families, generations of labor bound to the land. In Iceland alone, archaeological surveys suggest over 90% of early Norse settlers were farmers. And this land was no gentle Eden. Scandinavian soil was thin and acidic. Winters were long, growing seasons brief. The terrain, a mosaic of forest, fjord, and mountain, demanded adaptation at every level. But adapt, they did. Through centuries of lived experience and oral transmission, Viking farmers developed a deep knowledge of their environment, selecting crops and livestock suited to specific microclimates, experimenting with planting techniques, and even practicing forms of crop rotation and soil management centuries ahead of their time. In this world, women were not passive bystanders. They were the keepers of food wisdom, the brewers, the bakers, the gatherers of greens, the fermenters of milk, the guardians of seeds. They understood the right time to pull Skirwite from rocky soil, how to dry Angelica without killing its medicinal potency, when to let fat hen reseed along field edges, and when to harvest it for stew. A Viking woman might command her household with the same authority her brother wielded in war. In the sagas, women are often described in control of food stores, leading planting rituals, and even managing estates in the absence of their husbands. Their knowledge was the difference between feast and famine, healing and hunger. Consider Astrid, a hypothetical figure based on numerous archaeological and textual fragments of farmer's wife from central Norway in the mid-9th century. Her longhouse, roofed with turf and insulated with birch bark, housed not just her family, but her legacy. Under her care grew garden plots of onions, leeks, cabbages, and herbs. She managed the drying racks for fish and mushrooms. She brewed ale from barley and wild honey. She could prepare 6 kinds of broth with nothing but turnips, weeds, and bone. Her work was as essential to Viking survival as any axe or sail. Viking agriculture was a seasonal dance, tightly choreographed to the cycles of sun, frost, and flood. Spring was the season of sowing and foraging. Early greens like nettle, goosefoot, and sorrel were among the first fresh foods after a winter of dried meats and sour milk. Summer brought the hard work of cultivation, of hay cutting and vegetable tending. Autumn was a mad rush to harvest, to slaughter and preserve, to ferment and bury, to secure the long darkness ahead. Winter was the time of reckoning. Food stores were rationed with discipline. Meals grew smaller. Fermented vegetables became staples. The survival of a household depended not on luck, but on preparation, wisdom, and the ancient rituals of food preservation: smoking, drying, salting, burying, fermenting. Every mistake, a failed crop, a poorly dried fish, a spoiled root cellar, could mean death. And so knowledge passed not just through teaching, but through story, through ritual, through repetition, burned into the muscle memory of daily life. This agricultural foundation shaped more than just diet. It shaped Norse identity. The word bondi, meaning farmer, was used in the sagas to denote a free man. To farm was not shameful or secondary. It was a sign of status, of rootedness, of autonomy. To own land, to harvest grain, to provide for kin, this was honor. Even the warrior elite understood this. Many raiders returned home each winter not to halls of gold, but to farms' modest estates where their mothers and wives had kept the fire burning, the sheep fed, the root cellars full. The glory of the sword meant little without the quiet resilience of the spade. And yet, for all its centrality, this farming culture has been overshadowed by the image of the Viking warrior. The noisy spectacle of raids has eclipsed the silent heroism of those who planted turnips in frozen soil, who gathered herbs under midsummer moons, who survived famine with fermented roots and bitter greens. The great irony is that many of the foods most essential to this agricultural society, the humble plants and preservation methods that ensured life through scarcity were the first to be lost in the centuries that followed. Why? Because they were too common, because they were associated with poverty, with hunger, with the old ways. As Christianity spread and trade networks expanded, tastes shifted. Exotic spices replaced local herbs. Imported grains crowded out traditional root vegetables. Weeds were no longer honored, but eradicated. Women's food knowledge was silenced. The culinary knowledge of the Norse farmer was gradually forbidden not by decree, but by neglect. But the soil remembers, and so do we. To understand the forbidden foods of the Viking Age, we must begin here, not in the mead hall, but in the field, not with the warlord, but with the woman at the hearth. It was they who fed the North, and in feeding it, built the world that the raiders would later carry across the seas. Part 4. Angelica, the plant of prophets and plague. In the Viking world, plants were never just food. They were medicine, spirit, and symbol living threads woven into the fabric of survival and belief. And of all the plants cultivated and revered by the Norse people, none held as exalted a place as Angelica. To modern eyes, Angelica archangelica is an imposing herb tall, with hollow green stalks and great domed flower heads like umbels of frosted lace. But to a Viking, this plant was not merely a curiosity. It was a guardian, a healer, a gift from the gods, or perhaps something even older. It grew wild across the subarctic landscape, in the damp meadows and riverbanks of Norway, Iceland, and Greenland. But unlike many wild herbs, Angelica was also cultivated, carefully, deliberately, in garden plots beside longhouses and near sacred wells. Its name, in Norse kvane, still lingers in folk memory, though its power has long since faded from most tongues. But it was once among the most powerful plants in the Viking pharmacopoeia, and, as with many things of power, it was eventually forbidden, exiled not just from the table, but from the memory of the people who once revered it. Angelica was a cornerstone of Norse food and medicine. Every part of the plant was used: roots, stalks, leaves, seeds, and each part served a different function. In the spring, young stems were harvested and chewed raw or cooked into soups. They were prized for their sweet, musky flavor, a blend of celery, juniper, and pine, and for their rich content of vitamin C. This was no small thing. In a world where scurvy could decimate crews and communities during the long, dark months, Angelica was a lifesaver. In the summer, the seeds were collected and used as seasoning or infused in alcohol to create tonics for digestion, circulation, and respiratory health. In the autumn, the roots were dug up and dried, powerful, pungent, and loaded with volatile oils. These roots were brewed into infusions or soaked in ale, and given to the ill, the wounded, the old. Viking healers swore by them, and they weren't wrong. Modern pharmacology confirms Angelica's antimicrobial, antispasmodic, and anti-inflammatory properties. But Angelica was more than a tool. It was a presence. In Norse cosmology, where everything in the world bore a spirit tree, stone, mountain, stream, Angelica held a place between worlds. It was seen as protective, even sacred. The sagas do not speak of it directly, but folk traditions passed down in later Icelandic and Sami lore speak of kavane being planted near doorways or burned in ceremonies to ward off disease and evil spirits. The belief was that Angelica could see things humans could not, and when illness struck, whether physical or spiritual, it was Angelica that was summoned. Its Latin name, Angelica archangelica, tells another story, one of transition, one of conquest. According to Christian herbal lore, the plant was revealed to humankind by the archangel Raphael during a time of plague. It was said that the angel appeared to a monk in a dream and showed him the herb that could protect against death. Thus the name, Angelica, the angelic one. This story, though medieval and Christian in origin, grafted itself neatly onto older pagan traditions. For the Vikings, who were converting slowly and unevenly between the 9th and 11th centuries, such tales were familiar in tone: visions, revelation, plants of power, but something was lost in the translation. Where the Old Norse saw Angelica as part of the living landscape, a plant with agency, with ancestral memory, the new Christian narrative placed it within the realm of divine hierarchy. It became a tool of angels, not spirits of the earth, a symbol of Christian healing, not a wild protector. And with that shift came another, the beginning of forgetting. Angelica was not only medicinal, it was also a food of celebration. Stalks were sometimes candied in honey, a rare and precious commodity in the Viking world, and served during midwinter festivals or rites of spring. This created a confection that doubled as a healing tonic, something sweet, warming, fragrant. In a world with no sugar, it was a luxury almost beyond compare. But its flavor was strong. Too strong, some would say. As the Viking world became more connected to foreign markets, as ships brought in cinnamon from the east, nutmeg from the south, and eventually sugar from the distant colonies, the pungent taste of Angelica fell out of favor. It was too bitter, too herbal, too old. Modern palates, shaped by global trade and industrial agriculture, preferred the delicate over the wild, the uniform over the unpredictable. Angelica, which took 2 years to mature and required careful tending, couldn't compete. It was edged out by faster growing, sweeter, easier plants. And worse, it became associated with poverty, paganism, and primitiveness. Its uses dwindled, its gardens vanished, and in time, it was labeled a weed. Yet Angelica never truly disappeared. It lingers on the fringes in the remote valleys of western Norway, where a few elderly women still brew cavenatia for winter coughs. In the glass bottles of aquavit, where its essence flavors the spirits of the north. In old botanical texts, gathering dust in university archives. And now, in the soil once again, ethnobotanists and food archaeologists are rediscovering its traces in ancient seed banks, pollen samples, and genetic remnants. Experimental gardens in Iceland and Scandinavia are cultivating it anew, seeking not just its medicinal properties, but its cultural meaning. Because to reclaim Angelica is to reclaim something more than a plant. It is to reclaim a relationship with the land, one in which food was not divorced from medicine, and flavor was not separated from spirit. It is to remember that what we call forbidden was often once sacred, and that the plants which helped our ancestors survive the long winter night may yet hold the key to enduring the winters ahead. Part 5. Fat Hen, from Viking superfood to modern weed. In the corner of a forgotten Viking garden, a low-growing plant stretches toward the sun, modest, dusty green, its diamond-shaped leaves coated with a silvery sheen. Today, gardeners curse it. They pull it from flower beds, toss it into compost heaps, and call it by names like white goosefoot or worse, weed. But once in the age of axes and ash, when winters were long and hunger was near, this humble plant was revered. They called it Fat Hen, and for the Norse people it was not an intruder, but a lifeline. Fat Hen, Chenopodium album, thrived on the margins of fields, of forests, of memory. It grew best where the soil had been disturbed, along fence lines, near longhouse walls, and in the fallow furrows left behind after barley harvests. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed accidental, but to a Viking farmer, it was intentional. Evidence from archaeological digs, including charred seeds found in hearths, latrines, and storage pits at Norse settlements like Jorvik, York, and Hedeby, proves that Fat Hen was more than tolerated. It was cultivated, harvested, and stored. Seeds were collected in quantities too large for coincidence. In some places, it was planted alongside barley and rye, its staggered growth cycles, allowing families to stretch their harvest window further into lean times. Its nickname, fat hen, comes not from poultry, but from abundance. This was a plant that grew fast, produced heavily, and required no coaxing. It offered both edible greens and seeds, making it a complete food source and one that could be harvested multiple times across a single season. What made fat hen so invaluable was its nutritional profile. It was, by the standards of Viking life, and even by modern science, a superfood. Its leaves, when fresh, were rich in vitamin A, C, bone, calcium, iron, and protein, far exceeding many of the cultivated vegetables we value today. The seeds, small and numerous, were loaded with essential amino acids and healthy fats, making them a crucial fallback when meat or dairy was scarce. During the hunger gap, that perilous window in late winter and early spring, when root cellars emptied but new crops had yet to grow, fat hen was among the first to reappear. It grew even in the weak light of early spring. To a Norse family watching the last dried fish dwindle, the soft emergence of fat hen leaves from thawed earth was nothing short of salvation. In the Viking kitchen it was versatile. Young leaves boiled like spinach, or added raw to potages. Older leaves mixed into stews, or dried for winter use. Seeds ground into flour, and blended with barley to stretch bread supplies. Occasionally, seeds were fermented into a coarse, beer-like brew for sacred rituals or seasonal gatherings. In every part, it was useful. Nothing went to waste. Unlike some herbs and roots reserved for ritual use or medicinal elites, fat hen was common. It belonged to everyone: the poor, the landless, the old women who still knew where to find the good patches near the river. It grew near the margins of society, and so became part of the fabric of daily survival. Consider the story of Sigrid, a fictional but historically grounded figure, a thrall woman on a farmstead near what is now Trondheim. While her masters oversaw the barley fields, it was Sigrid who gathered the fat hen each spring. She knew which patches emerged first. She knew how to dry the leaves on a flat rock near the hearth, how to grind the seeds into a gritty flour that baked best when mixed with lard. She had learned from her grandmother, and her daughters would learn from her. For Sigrid, fat hen was not a weed, it was wealth. So what happened? Why did a plant so essential vanish from our diets and our memories? The decline of fat hen followed a familiar path: the slow eclipse of folk knowledge by institutional agriculture. With the rise of feudal systems and later industrialized farming, wild and semi-wild crops were seen as inconvenient. They grew unpredictably. They didn't respond well to plowing. Their appearance varied. Their yields were inconsistent. In contrast, crops like spinach, cabbage, and modern grains offered uniformity, easier to grow in rows, to harvest mechanically, to package and sell. Fat hen, with its free spirit and rough texture, couldn't compete. Worse, it was rebranded. No longer seen as food, it became a nuisance. Botanists and agriculturalists classified it as a weed. Its nutritional power was ignored, its history erased. Even the name fat hen became a kind of insult, a joke among gardeners. The idea that it had once graced the cooking pots of Viking households, that it had saved lives through famine and war, seemed laughable. But the land remembers. In recent decades, as interest in ancestral diets and foraged foods has returned, fat hen is beginning to reappear. Foragers praise it. Herbalists re-examine it. Ethnobotanists trace its uses back thousands of years across Europe and Central Asia. In parts of India, it is still cultivated as bathua. In Mexico, its cousin quelitz remains a staple green. Yet in the lands of the Old Norse, its role has largely been forgotten. which makes its story a cautionary one. Not every forbidden food was banned by priests or kings. Some were lost more quietly through shame, fashion, and the slow erosion of memory. When knowledge becomes inconvenient, it dies not with a curse, but with a shrug. But in the shadow of climate uncertainty and the search for sustainable nutrition, fat hen may yet rise again from compost pile to kitchen, from forgotten weed to sacred green. It's waiting, as it always has, on the edge of things ready to return. Part 6. Skirwite, the root that healed and nourished. In the harsh uplands of Viking Age Scandinavia, where the soil turned to stone and wind carried the sharp tang of snow even in spring, life had to dig deep to survive. So did the people, and so did their plants. Among the most treasured of these was Skirwite, a root so tenacious it clung to the poorest mountain soils, and so revered it became both food and medicine. Known in later medieval texts as spignel or bald money, Skirwite was a plant of paradox, unremarkable to the eye, but priceless to those who understood its power. Today, few have even heard its name. Yet in Viking times, it was part of the sacred landscape of survival, a food source carved from the edge of starvation, and a healer whispered over by midwives and wise women. Skirwite, Meum athamanticum, is a delicate perennial herb with feathery foliage like wild dill and a long, tapering root that resembles a pale, slender carrot. It prefers high elevations, well-drained soils, and sparse competition, which made it ideal for the thin, rocky hillsides where other crops failed. For Viking farmers in mountainous regions of Norway, Iceland, and western Sweden, Skirwite was more than a curiosity. It was deliberately cultivated, not for show, but for survival. Its ability to return year after year without replanting made it an ideal food in a land where the growing season was short and the labor force stretched thin. Unlike barley or turnips, Skirwite could be planted once and left to its own devices. It took 2 years to mature, but once established, it yielded reliably each autumn, a secret store of calories hidden beneath the frost-hardened earth. Every part of the plant held value. The root was the centerpiece, rich in starches, essential oils, and bitter compounds that stimulated digestion and offered anti-inflammatory effects. When roasted in the embers of a hearth, it produced an aroma that mingled the sweetness of parsnip with the sharpness of anise. It could be boiled into soups, grated into winter porridges, or dried and ground into powder to stretch flour supplies. The leaves, though less commonly eaten, were used as seasoning, their flavor complex and herbaceous, somewhere between parsley, fennel, and wild celery. In some traditions, they were brewed into tea for coughs, fevers, or menstrual pains. Midwives and healers especially prized Skirwite. In the dark months, when illness spread through tightly packed longhouses, they turned to this root, not just for sustenance, but for protection. It was known to warm the belly, stimulate appetite in the weak, and ease the pains of childbirth. Some Viking households kept a bundle of dried Skirwite above the hearth, both as medicine and as charm. Skirwite did not grow everywhere. Its natural habitat limited it to specific regions, often highland areas less suited to grains or livestock. As such, it became associated with the boundary lands, the places where human settlement thinned and the wild crept close. In these places, knowledge was everything. A Viking woman who lived near the tree line might have known precisely when to dig Skirwite after the first frost, when its sugars concentrated and its flavor sweetened. She might have passed that knowledge to her daughter not through writing, but through a ritual, digging the root on the night of the waning moon, offering a pinch of barley to the earth in thanks. This plant, though never mentioned in the sagas, lived in the spaces between their lines in the kitchens, the medicine bundles, the hunger gaps of real life. It did not feed armies. It fed the forgotten. Archaeological finds across Scandinavia confirm Skirwite's presence. Seeds, root fragments, and pollen traces have been uncovered in farmsteads dating to the 9th and 10th centuries, especially in western Norway and parts of the Swedish highlands. Some sites show evidence of deliberate cultivation, raised beds in marginal land, with drainage stones carefully laid to prevent rot. In the refuse heaps of these settlements, researchers have found charred skirwite remains alongside bones, barley husks, and ash, evidence that the root was cooked, consumed, and likely treasured enough to be preserved. At a site in southern Iceland, a cache of dried roots was discovered in a sod-walled storage chamber carefully bundled in birch bark and sealed with clay. Analysis showed the presence of volatile oils consistent with skirwite. The bundle had been wrapped and hidden, as if the family feared losing it or knew it would not be replaced. Such finds suggest that skirwite was not just another root, it was a strategic crop, a hedge against starvation, and a medicine chest in a single plant. So why did skirwite disappear? Its downfall was tied to many of the same forces that erased Angelica and Fat Hen: the rise of commercial agriculture, the shift toward uniform crops, and the increasing power of centralized authorities, first chieftains, then kings, then priests. Skirwite was slow to grow. It yielded irregularly. It didn't conform to neat rows or plowing patterns. And its flavor, bold and bittersweet, became unfashionable as diets shifted toward refined grains and imported spices. By the late medieval period, skirwite had largely vanished from the Norse foodscape. Its knowledge survived only in fragments in medicinal texts copied by monks, in rural folklore, and in the Highland traditions of Scotland and Norway, where old women still brewed bald money tea for winter ailments. Eventually, even these threads unraveled. In recent years, skirwite has made a quiet return not to the supermarket, but to experimental farms, heritage gardens, and the notebooks of ethnobotanists. As the modern world searches for forgotten foods that can thrive in poor soils and harsh climates, this root has begun to attract attention once again. Its resilience, once a relic, now feels revolutionary. And its story from revered sustainer to forgotten weed reminds us that food is not merely biology, it is culture, memory, meaning. Skirwite fed the Norse not with spectacle but with persistence. It waited beneath the frost, unseen, until the time came to rise again. So too, perhaps, does its legacy. Part 7. The Sea Harvest. Forgotten Coastal Superfoods. To understand how the Vikings truly fed themselves, one must turn not only to the land, to the barley fields and grazing slopes, but to the sea. The Norse world was one of coastlines, long fingers of fjords carved deep into the land, tying farms to the salt water like veins. Even inland, rivers ran quick to the shore. This was not merely a landscape, it was a lifescape built around the ocean's gifts. And among those gifts were foods now forgotten: coastal greens, sea vegetables, salt-tolerant roots, and fermented marine delicacies, once essential, now vanished, or taboo. These were the sea harvests, nature's pharmacy, pantry, and ritual offering, once revered, now forbidden, but never truly gone. For the coastal Vikings of Norway, the Faroes, Iceland, and the Baltic Isles, the intertidal zone was a living larder. They understood its rhythm like a heartbeat. Twice a day the ocean drew back its veil, revealing not just shellfish and driftwood, but entire meadows of edible life: sea kale, sugar kelp, samphire, saltwort, sea arrowgrass, and others now known only to foragers and botanists. These weren't side dishes. They were staples rich in vitamins, iodine, and minerals. They prevented scurvy in the winter months, balanced the high protein of fish and meat, and offered flavor notes the Norse palate understood: brine, bitterness, and deep umami. In particular, sea kale, Crambe maritima, held a revered place. It grew on shingle beaches in tight rosettes, its waxy leaves resisting the salt spray, its roots plunging deep into the gravel. When boiled or steamed, the leaves turned tender, rich with a flavor akin to asparagus and broccoli. The stems were often pickled or fermented, preserved in clay crocks sealed with beeswax. Sea kale was one of the first greens to emerge in spring, a sacred signal of the turning year. In coastal farms, women walked barefoot to harvest it with knives of bone or horn, singing old songs to honor the plant's return. Modern science tells us that kelp and other seaweeds are nutritional marvels, packed with iodine, calcium, magnesium, and rare trace elements. The Vikings knew this through experience. Sugar kelp, Saccharina latissima, a long brown ribbon of seaweed with a naturally sweet flavor, was dried on stones or hung from roof beams. In some regions, it was chopped into fish stews, boiled into broths, or added to fermented grain gruels for a salty depth. Its sweetness, subtle but unmistakable, was cherished in a world without sugar. Kelp also preserved. When layered with fish or meat, it helped ward off spoilage and added umami richness over time. Mixed with dried herbs and fat, it formed a kind of sea paste stored in leather pouches and eaten by travelers or given to pregnant women for strength. But kelp's value extended beyond the stomach. In some sagas and folk fragments, it is hinted that dried kelp was burned as incense during rituals. The scent-sharp, oceanic cleansing was said to purify the home during childbirth, or send prayers to the gods before a voyage. On tidal flats and estuaries, another kind of harvest grew, samphire, salicornia, with its succulent green stems, was prized as a crunchy, salty treat eaten raw, pickled in whey, or dried for winter use. Sea arrowgrass, though mildly toxic if eaten in large quantities, was used in trace amounts as seasoning, its intense flavor rivaling modern horseradish. Sea beet offered spinach-like leaves from rocky shores. These plants flourished in places few dared to cultivate: muddy shoals, brackish swamps, storm-battered inlets. Yet the Norse sought them out. Children would follow mothers through tide flats with baskets woven from birch root, gathering greens in silence. Elders taught how to dry the leaves in sun-warmed hollows. In lean years, these coastal vegetables could make the difference between survival and sickness. Among the most mysterious and maligned of Viking seafoods was fermented fish. We think today of hakarl, the infamous fermented Greenland shark still eaten in Iceland, or surströmming, Sweden's fermented herring. But these are echoes of an older tradition, one deeply embedded in Viking food culture. In coastal Norse settlements, fish guts, heads, and skins were not thrown away. They were layered in pits with seaweed, covered with stones, and left to ferment for weeks or months. The resulting paste, rich in omega fats, enzymes, and umami compounds, was consumed in small amounts, often mixed with grains or used to flavor broth. To modern tastes, the smell alone would be unbearable. But to the Vikings, it was powerful food, high energy, shelf-stable, and spiritually charged. Some fermented fish preparations were even ritualized. In pre-Christian belief, the transformation of raw fish into something potent and preserved mirrored the transformation of life through death, of chaos into order. It was an alchemy of the shore guided by women, honored by warriors. So why did these superfoods disappear? In part because of shame. As Christianity spread, so did moral judgments about food. The use of strong-smelling ferments, coastal weeds, and fish innards was gradually labeled unclean or low. Clerics wrote disparagingly of such dishes. Food that had once been sacred became associated with poverty, primitiveness, and paganism. In parallel, trade introduced refined foods from abroad. Grains became standard. Spices replaced herbs. The ancient relationship with tidal food was broken. By the 14th century, most of the coastal greens were dismissed as weeds. Fermented fish became a curiosity or a joke. Kelp harvesting, once a sacred rite, became industrialized, used for glass making and fertilizer, not food. 1,000 years of knowledge was unlearned, but the tide is never still. In recent years, chefs and foragers across Scandinavia have begun to reclaim these lost ocean foods. Sea kale is being reintroduced to coastal farms. Kelp and seaweed are prized for their sustainability. Even fermented fish, long the butt of culinary mockery, is being reconsidered through the lens of microbial gastronomy. Archaeologists, too, have returned to the coast. At sites in Iceland and Greenland, they've uncovered the bones of seabirds, layers of kelp ash, and midden heaps filled with sea vegetable remains, proving that the Vikings didn't just endure the coast. They thrived on it. The sea harvest may have been forbidden, but it was never useless, never weak, never forgotten by the land, only by us. And now, as tides rise and climates shift, we may need these foods more than ever. Part 8. Fermented roots and forgotten brews. The hearth was more than a source of warmth in the Viking longhouse. It was the center of chemistry, of transformation, of life itself. Around it, roots softened, grains soured, liquids bubbled in carved wooden barrels or horn vessels wrapped in leather. And in this dim, fragrant heart of the home, the Norse mastered one of the oldest and most powerful arts of all: fermentation. Fermentation was not an option in the Viking world. It was a necessity, a way to preserve food without salt or smoke, a method to extract more nutrition from stubborn roots, a sacred process that blurred the boundary between food and magic. Among the most mysterious and now forgotten parts of the Viking diet were the fermented roots and rustic brews that once sustained them through the leanest months. Not the sweet meads of saga fame, but sour, earthy, life-giving concoctions brewed in shadow and silence. These were the foods of survival, and now they are nearly lost. Modern science celebrates fermentation for its probiotic benefits, but the Vikings needed no biochemistry to understand its power. They learned through experience that certain foods, when allowed to rot under control, became not dangerous, but more potent, more digestible, more sustaining, even medicinal. Fermentation turned cabbage and Angelica into winter pickles that warded off scurvy. It transformed skim milk into skyr, a thick, tangy cheese, eaten by farmers and warriors alike. But perhaps most fascinating were the fermented roots, a category of Viking food that combined the botanical world with deep knowledge of time, temperature, and microbial alchemy. Among the most common fermented roots were turnips, parsnips, skirwite, and in some regions, wild carrots and burdock. These were not simply pickled. They were often buried in pits, layered with ash or straw, or soaked in sour whey and left for weeks or even months. What emerged was not quite vegetable, not quite broth. It was transformation. In one Icelandic saga fragment, a winter feast is described where root broth, aged and sharp, was served with dried fish and rye. Scholars now believe this may have referred to fermented turnip stew, a dish that began in autumn and wasn't eaten until deep winter. Here's how it might have been made. 1. Turnips were harvested after the first frost to maximize sugar content. 2. They were peeled, sliced, and layered with herbs like Angelica, mustard seed, or caraway. 3. The layers were packed in a pit lined with birch bark and sealed with stones and clay. 4. After 4-6 weeks, the turnips softened and soured, developing complex flavors and beneficial bacteria. 5. They were then boiled into a stew with dried fish, blood sausage, or roasted bones, forming a complete winter meal. This wasn't food made for pleasure. It was made for endurance. And yet, those who remembered it in oral traditions, handed down in remote villages, described it not only as nourishing but strangely delicious, a food that satisfied a craving deeper than hunger, the craving for life preserved. Not all fermented roots were stews. Some became drinks bitter, sour, mildly alcoholic, or medicinal. The Vikings brewed rudimentary ales from barley and oats, flavored with herbs rather than hops. But alongside this tradition was another, root brews. In coastal settlements, women boiled roots of Skirwite, Angelica, and celandine, then left the liquid to ferment with wild yeasts, sometimes adding honey, sometimes not. The resulting drink was cloudy, pungent, and mildly intoxicating. It was said to open the lungs, strengthen the belly, and in some cases, invite visions. Such brews were not taken casually. Some were reserved for seasonal rites, healing ceremonies, or the preparation of warriors before battle. Others were drunk in silence during midwinter nights, when the line between the living and the dead grew thin. The Norse did not separate food from ritual. When they drank these brews, they communed with ancestors and with the land that grew their sustenance. A particularly intriguing tradition comes from Eastern Norse settlements near the edges of Slavic lands. Here, a fermented drink akin to kvass made from old bread, roots, or grains may have entered the Viking diet through cultural contact. Some versions included roasted turnips or carrots, boiled down and left to sour. The result was a low-alcohol beverage that kept well in cold climates, prevented dehydration, and offered complex flavor, a precursor to beer, but with a different soul. Though rarely mentioned in the sagas, these drinks left their trace in archaeological finds. Fermentation pots coated with root starches and lactic acid residues, wooden staves etched with symbols of health and protection, pits lined with roots in long-abandoned farmsteads. These were not just drinks. They were recipes of resilience. So what happened to these fermented root foods? The answer is twofold: Christianization and industrialization. As Christianity spread, it brought with it a new attitude toward food, one that prized cleanliness, order, and sweetness over the earthy, wild, sour tastes of old. Fermented roots began to seem rustic, unclean, even sinful. Their association with pre-Christian rites, particularly women-led healing rituals, marked them as suspect. Later, as trade expanded and sugar became available, the pungent flavors of fermented roots were further pushed aside. Sweetened beer replaced bitter tonic. Imported grains replaced wild tubers. The pit in the earth gave way to the iron pot. By the 17th century, fermented root brews had vanished almost completely from Scandinavian kitchens. Only in rural corners, the Faroe Islands, parts of Lapland, isolated Norwegian valleys, did whispers of the old recipes survive. Today, as modern science rediscovers the value of fermented foods, the Viking way seems not primitive, but prescient. Their use of lactic fermentation, wild yeasts, and seasonal preservation speaks to a deep ecological intelligence, one we are only beginning to understand. These weren't mere traditions. They were technologies of survival, shaped over centuries, encoded in taste and time. In reviving fermented root traditions, we don't just honor a culinary past. We reconnect with a philosophy of food that sees nourishment as a dialogue with nature, a transformation, not just a transaction. Because in that bubbling brew, in the pit beneath the longhouse, in the sharp tang of a root stew, there lived the Viking will to endure. Part 9. The Forbidden Fungi. In the damp birch woods beyond the cleared fields of the Viking farmstead, something ancient grows in silence. It pushes up through the moss after summer rains, swelling in the shadow of stones and roots. Its flesh is pale or golden or blood red. It smells of earth, of decay, of mystery. And in the eyes of the Norse, it was never just a mushroom. It was a spirit, a messenger from beneath, a food to be approached with caution, reverence, and in time, fear. Among the most powerful and most forgotten components of the Viking diet were fungi, edible, medicinal, and in some cases, psychoactive mushrooms. They were gathered, used, and traded, but also shrouded in taboo. As Christianity overtook the old gods, many of these fungi came to be seen as demonic, dangerous, or simply undesirable. Today, their role in Norse life is barely remembered, but in the shadows of the sagas and in the soil of ancient forests, their story endures. The Norse had no written botanical textbooks, but they didn't need them. Knowledge of mushrooms, which to pick, when to pick, how to dry, how to cook or avoid, was passed down through generations of women, hunters, and healers. Some mushrooms were common food. Chanterelles, boletes, and woodbluets were gathered in woven birch baskets, sliced with bone knives, and dried on racks above the hearth. Their umami depth made them prized ingredients in root stews and broth. In fall, these mushrooms were roasted alongside meat or simmered with barley in clay pots. Others were more dangerous. The Norse knew that some fungi could kill. The death cap and destroying angel were recognized and avoided, their appearance logged in the minds of those who lived close to the land. But a few mushrooms occupied a stranger place, a place between nourishment and revelation. Chief among these was the fly agaric, Amanita muscaria, the iconic red-capped mushroom with white warts, known today more for fairy tales than for food. But to the ancient Norse, it was neither myth nor metaphor. It was a substance of power. Fly agaric grows under birch and pine across northern Europe, including vast tracts of Viking territory. It is psychoactive, containing compounds that alter perception, heighten strength, and distort time. Consumed raw, it is toxic, but parboiled, dried, or consumed indirectly, it produces potent effects including euphoria, aggression, visions, and insensitivity to pain. This may explain its whispered connection to berserkers, the legendary Viking warriors, said to enter battle in a trance-like fury, howling like wolves, feeling no fear or blade. While scholars debate the role of mushrooms in berserker rites, many agree that fly agaric was known and used, likely in carefully controlled ritual contexts. It was never food in the usual sense. It was sacred pharmacology. Beyond the mystical, mushrooms served more mundane and no less vital purposes in Viking health. The birch polypore, Fomitopsis betulina, was a shelf fungus found on dead or dying birch trees. When dried, it was ground into powder or soaked in water to create an antimicrobial poultice used on wounds and infections. The chaga mushroom, though less common in Viking heartlands, may have reached northern Norse regions through trade with Finno-Ugric peoples. It was burned and inhaled to relieve lung ailments or steeped into a bitter black tonic believed to improve endurance during cold months. These fungal medicines were not distinct from food, they were part of the same continuum. To eat was to heal, to brew was to balance the body. In this worldview, every living thing had potential, if used with respect. So why were mushrooms forgotten? Why did such a rich tradition vanish? The answer lies not in biology, but in belief. As Christianity spread through Scandinavia, it brought a new lens through which to view nature, one that categorized and judged, that valued order and feared ambiguity. Mushrooms unpredictable, emerging without seed or stem, decaying yet powerful, came to be seen as symbols of corruption, chaos, and witchcraft. The same qualities that once marked them as sacred now rendered them suspicious. In particular, the fly agaric became a source of unease. Stories of berserkers shifted from awe to horror. Mushroom-induced trances were rebranded as demonic possession. Women who gathered fungi in the forest, once herbalists, saith Kona, or respected midwives, became suspect, other, or silenced. Within a few generations, mushrooms were no longer revered. They were ignored, or worse, reviled. The once sacred fungi of the Norse disappeared from diet, from ritual, from respectable memory. And yet, Mushrooms do not care what humans remember. They return with the rains, sprouting silently in the same birch woods where Viking children once followed their mothers with empty baskets and careful eyes. The knowledge survives too fragmented in folk tales, revived by foragers, rediscovered by mycologists and ethnobotanists. In parts of Sweden and Norway, the fly agaric is once again studied for its potential role in ancient ritual. The birch polypore is now recognized by modern medicine for its anti-inflammatory properties. And edible wild fungi are re-entering Scandinavian cuisine not as novelties but as parts of a deeper culinary past. To eat a mushroom is to engage in transformation. That was always the point. For the Vikings, fungi bridged the gap between the seen and unseen. They brought food, medicine, madness, and mystery. They offered visions and vitality. They were a gift from the forest, one we turned away from too soon. And now, as the old hunger for forgotten wisdom grows, perhaps we are ready to return to that edge of the woods, to gather again, to remember. Part 10. The Blood Foods. Nutrition at a sacred cost. When winter gripped the Viking world in silence, when the fjords iced over and the forests stilled, survival narrowed to a question of what remained. No green grew, no fruit ripened. Even root cellars began to thin. In these bleak months, one substance stood between life and starvation. It was rich in iron, protein, and fat. It carried warmth, memory, and power. It was feared by outsiders, sacred to those who understood it, and eventually forbidden. That substance was blood. For the Norse, blood foods made from the fresh blood of slaughtered animals were not only practical, they were ritual. They marked the cycle of life and death, tied kinship to land, and turned slaughter into sacrament. But as with so many Viking traditions, blood foods would later be erased, scorned, and forgotten not because they failed, but because they threatened the tidy boundaries of religion, morality, and modern taste. In the Old Norse calendar, slaughter was not done piecemeal. Each autumn, often in late October or early November, before the deep cold Viking farmers participated in a collective slaughter known as blot. This was more than logistics. It was cosmic choreography. Blot meant sacrifice, not only of animals but of the old year, of weakness, of all that could not be carried into the next season. Cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats were selected, the old, the weak, or those deemed surplus. Their deaths were swift, but not silent. At the heart of the blot was blood. The blood of these animals was not discarded. It was collected in wooden bowls, stirred with birch branches, and in some cases, splashed upon stone altars, carved idols, and even the beams of the longhouse. It was an offering to the gods, to Freyr for fertility, to Odin for strength, to Hel for passage into the underworld. But not all of it was burned or spilled. Some was preserved, some was cooked. This was not waste. This was wisdom. The most common form of blood food was blothmer blood sausage. To make it, women would mix fresh blood with barley or oat groats, suet, wild herbs, like thyme or yarrow, and sometimes diced fat or meat scraps. The mixture was spooned into cleaned intestines, tied with twine, and boiled in great iron pots, hung above the hearth. The resulting sausages were dark, dense, and sustaining, rich in iron, protein, and slow-burning energy. They were eaten hot during feasting nights, or cooled and stored in cold rooms for later. Blothmer was not merely nourishment. It was a communal food, made in the liminal days after slaughter, when the whole household worked together to transform death into sustenance. For some families, the making of blood sausage was ritualized. A portion might be set aside for ancestors. Another might be shared with neighbors. Some households sang quiet songs while stirring the blood not to the gods, but to the memory of those who had eaten before. Beyond sausage, blood was used in other ways. In times of scarcity, it could be mixed with rye flour and baked into flatbreads blackened, chewy, and sour sweet. Blood bread was often the food of the poor or of lean years, but it carried immense caloric value and kept well when dried. Blood was also boiled into soups and broths, often flavored with vinegar or whey to prevent coagulation. These blood broths were sometimes consumed during illness or after childbirth, seen as restorative, warming, life-giving. Among warriors, especially in northern Norway and Iceland, it was common to drink a hot blood broth after long hunts or sea voyages. It was said to warm the bones and return strength to the limbs. This was not barbarism, it was precision nutrition, a knowledge of blood as a resource, carefully harvested, transformed, and respected. In Norse belief, blood held more than calories. It held essence. To spill blood was to invite attention from the gods and the dead. To consume it was to commune with the forces of vitality and death. Thus, blood foods occupied a strange and sacred space, one that was both daily and ceremonial. Children were taught to never waste blood, to respect the animal, to understand the labor and the lineage behind every sausage, every stew. There are hints in archaeological finds, small bone knives stained dark, ceremonial ladles, carved wooden stirrers marked with runes that the making of blood food was, at least in part, a ritual art. Not every household kept these tools, but among those who did, the practice appears consistent across centuries. When Christianity spread through Scandinavia, it brought with it new food laws, some derived from ancient Judaic precedent, others from evolving church doctrine, and in nearly all of them, blood food was condemned. It was called unclean, an abomination, a mark of paganism. By the 11th century, newly baptized Norse lords were pressured to abandon the blot and its associated feasts. Consuming blood, even animal blood, was increasingly framed as barbaric, superstitious, and dangerous to the soul. In sermons and letters, priests decried the use of blood in cooking as heathen indulgence. Some converts went further, destroying family tools used in blood food preparation. Recipes were lost, practices hidden. In time, the very idea of eating blood became distasteful even among descendants who had once relied on it for survival. Blood foods were forbidden not for health but for control. And yet, fragments remain. In parts of Iceland, blóðmör is still made, though now stripped of ritual. In rural Norway and Sweden, blood pancakes and soups persist as winter delicacies, served without the sacred context that once framed them. But in most of the world, Viking blood foods have vanished, their legacy buried beneath centuries of taboo, shame, and forgetting. To rediscover them is not merely to rediscover a recipe. It is to reclaim a way of seeing death as nourishment, of understanding food as something earned through labor, sacrifice, and respect. For the Vikings, food was never just what came from the field or the sea. It was also what came from within, the blood of the animal, the blood of the land, the blood of the past. To eat was to remember, and in the long, cold, memory could mean survival. Part 11. Milk in the Mist, the vanishing art of raw dairy. In the early hours before the sun breached the cold horizon, a thin mist would rise from the pastures of a Viking farmstead. Cows stood motionless in the haze, shaggy-coated and horned, their breath steaming like spirits. From the longhouse, a woman would emerge, wooden pail in hand, cloaked in wool. She approached without fear, without sound. This was not merely work, it was ritual. With practiced hands, she drew forth a substance more than food, raw milk, still warm from the animal, rich with fat, microbes, and living memory. To the Norse, milk was not just sustenance. It was a transformative element, a bridge between seasons, a canvas for survival. and the raw, unpasteurized, untouched dairy they consumed was unlike anything we taste today. Yet much of this world has vanished not through lack of need, but through neglect, taboo, and the industrial silence of stainless steel and sealed cartons. This is the story of milk in the mist, the art of Viking dairy, that once nourished a civilization and then slipped into oblivion. The Viking world was not a meat-first society, as often assumed. Meat was seasonal, tied to slaughter cycles, but dairy, particularly from cattle, goats, and sheep, was a daily lifeline, especially for inland and highland communities where fish or grain were scarce. Milk came fresh in spring and summer, when animals birthed young and the grass was sweet. It was consumed raw in its freshest state, foaming, full-bodied, slightly grassy, or transformed into cheese, butter, curds, and fermented drinks to last the winter. There were no fridges, no pasteurization, no factories, but the Norse had knowledge, honed over generations, when to milk, how to store, how to sour, and ferment with precision. The microbiome of a longhouse's dairy room was as familiar as its hearth shaped by smoke, stone, and time. Of all Viking dairy products, none was more iconic than skyr, still consumed in Iceland today, albeit in a modern, tamed form. Ancient skyr was closer to a cultured curd cheese than to yogurt. It was made by adding a portion of last season's fermented milk to fresh raw milk, then letting it culture slowly in cool, stone-lined cellars. The resulting product was strained through wool or horsehair cloths until it reached a dense, creamy texture, slightly sour, high in protein, and shelf-stable for months when kept cold. Skyr was packed into birch bark containers or buried in cool earth. It could be mixed with honey or berries, spread on bread, or eaten alone by warriors before battle. Archaeological finds in Iceland and Norway confirm skyr production as early as the 9th century. Clay pots lined with milk residue reveal lactobacillus cultures still intact, a frozen fingerprint of an ancient living food. And unlike today's pasteurized version, Viking skyr was alive, teeming with beneficial bacteria that strengthened digestion, immunity, and endurance. The Norse had no fear of sourness. In fact, it was desired. When fresh milk turned, as it naturally did within hours, it was not thrown away. It was carefully managed, encouraged to ferment in predictable ways. Soured milk, surmjölk, became a staple in porridges, stews, and broths. It added tang, body, and calories. It bound together grain and blood, root and herb. Some households maintained perpetual fermentation jars, vessels that were never fully emptied, whose walls held the microbial memory of decades. These mother cultures were passed between generations like heirlooms. They were never washed, only refilled. This microbial legacy was not accidental. It was essential. In a world without refrigeration, milk had to become something else, not through sterilization, but transformation. In the sagas, butter is often mentioned not just as food, but as a marker of wealth and generosity. To serve guests a wooden bowl of thick yellow butter, alongside barley bread and cured meat, was to declare one's status and stewardship of the land. Viking butter was made from raw cream, separated slowly and churned by hand, often in goatskin bags suspended from beams, swung rhythmically by children or the elderly. The resulting butter was not uniform. Its taste changed with the seasons, the diet of the animals, and the bacterial cultures of the house. In high summer, it was golden and sweet. In late autumn, darker and richer, almost nutty. Butter was used in cooking, in preservation. Meat buried in fat jars could last all winter, and even in ritual. In some regions, it was offered at burial mounds, shaped into discs or figurines, left for the dead to feast upon in the next world. Cheese in the Viking world came in many forms: hard, soft, curdled, aged. Goat cheese, in particular, was prized in mountainous areas where cattle struggled. Farmers shaped cheese into wheels and aged them in stone caves, where temperature and moisture allowed natural rinds to form. The use of rennet extracted from the stomachs of slaughtered calves reveals the sophistication of Viking cheesemaking. This enzyme allowed for faster curdling and firmer textures, indicating a knowledge passed through oral instruction and hands-on apprenticeship. Some cheeses were smoked over the hearth, others were soaked in brine or rubbed with wild herbs like thyme and Angelica. They weren't uniform. They were alive, each one a product of place, season, and memory. So what happened? Why did such a complex and nourishing dairy tradition disappear? As with blood foods and fermented roots, the fall came in stages. The Christianization of Scandinavia introduced new food taboos, including skepticism about sour foods, raw substances, and anything associated with female-centered production. Dairy work, long the domain of women, was devalued, removed from ritual importance, and eventually industrialized. Later, the rise of pasteurization in the modern era brought fear of microbes, and with it, the loss of raw milk culture. Safety trumped tradition. Uniformity replaced flavor. The deep microbial identities of Viking longhouses were sterilized away. What remains today in yogurt cups and butter bricks is a shadow of what once was. And yet, like all forbidden foods, the spirit lingers. Raw milk is being rediscovered by artisan cheesemakers and fermentation revivalists. Skyr is being remade from heirloom cultures. Across Scandinavia, small farms are once again churning butter by hand, aging cheese in caves, experimenting with natural rinds and sour curds. They are not inventing, they are remembering. In doing so, they connect with something ancient, a way of eating that honored life, not through control, but through coexistence with animals, with microbes, with time. Because Viking dairy wasn't just about milk, it was about trust in nature's processes, in generational wisdom, in the rhythms of mist and marrow. And when the mist lifts, we may yet taste it again. Part 12. Grains of the Wild, Forbidden Cereal, Crops of the North. Before the neat rows of wheat blanketed Europe, before barley became a staple of civilization, before oats found their way into morning porridge, there were other grains, wild, tenacious, misunderstood. In the lands of the Norse, where rocky soils and cold seasons challenged even the hardiest farmers, these forbidden cereals once played a vital role. They were not domesticated in the modern sense. They grew on the margins in meadows, riverbanks, and forest edges, harvested by hand, stored in bundles, and ground with stone. These were the lost grains of the Viking world, crops whose names are forgotten, whose textures would feel alien on modern tongues. But to the Norse, they were not alternatives. They were the originals. Today, almost none remain in common use, but the archaeological soil still holds their memory, and if we listen closely, the wind through the wild grasses may whisper their forgotten names. Before cultivated rye, secale cereal, was widely adopted in Europe. The Vikings, especially in the eastern regions of their world, encountered its wild cousin, wild rye, secale montanum, and related species. These hardy grains grew without sowing, often on disturbed or burned land. They were small, uneven, difficult to thresh but resilient. Unlike wheat, they tolerated acidic soils and short seasons. Viking farmers in southern Sweden and the Baltic region would sometimes intercrop wild rye with barley, allowing both to grow together. Wild rye was often used not for bread, but for gruel, boiled into thick, sour mash, with whey or water. In lean seasons, it was roasted and eaten like parched grain, or ground and mixed with fish paste for preservation. Eventually, domesticated rye replaced its wild ancestors. But those first grains, gathered by hand, were more than filler. They were a bridge between foraging and farming, and they sustained generations before the plow arrived. In a fragmentary 10th century Norse poem recovered in Iceland, a grain called narthex is named as a gift from the gods, a grass that sings when burnt and fills the belly like fish. Scholars debate the identification, but some believe narthex refers to an ancient reed, grass cereal, possibly a regional subspecies of reed canary grass, Phalaris arundinacea, which produces small, carbohydrate-rich seeds. Though toxic in high quantities when raw due to certain alkaloids, these seeds could be made edible through leaching, drying, and fermentation processes well known to Viking women. The seeds were reportedly used to make cakes wrapped in leaves, then baked under ash or embers. No modern record of such food survives. It was likely abandoned with the rise of more efficient grains. But in old soil layers near Viking hearths in Denmark and western Norway, charred canary grass seeds have been found in cooking vessels, suggesting its role as emergency grain, if not everyday fare. As we saw in Part 5, Fat Hen, Chenopodium album, was a critical foraged plant, but its seeds, along with those of knotgrass, Polygonum aviculare, formed a class of forgotten cereal-like foods known collectively in ethnobotany as field-edge grains. These tiny seeds, gathered from plants growing on disturbed land and fallow fields, were once ground into flour or added whole to gruel. Though low in yield, they were nutritionally dense, high in micronutrients and plant protein. Mixed with animal fat or blood, they formed energy-rich cakes for travelers or warriors. The effort required to harvest them stooping, threshing by hand, sifting with haircloth sieves was immense. But in a world without surplus, even a little grain could mean survival. Today, these plants are labeled as weeds. Their seeds have vanished from our plates, but their carbonized remains still appear in the ash layers of Viking longhouses, clustered near hearths and storage pits, a silent testament to their forgotten value. Though einkorn, Triticum monococcum, and emmer, Triticum dicoccum, are best known from Neolithic farming in the Near East, both grains appear in Viking-era sites, particularly in Gotland, Öland, and southern Norway. These grains were ancient imports, never fully domesticated in Scandinavia but maintained in small, local plots, perhaps as heritage crops or for ceremonial use. They required different processing than modern wheat. The tough husks had to be removed by fire roasting or pounding, and the resulting flour was dense, nutty, and oily, ideal for flatbreads and porridge. Emmer, in particular, was resistant to mold and stored well in damp climates. It may have been used by Viking ships on long voyages, baked into hard cakes and sealed with waxed linen. But as new cereal strains spread with Christian agricultural reforms, these ancient grains were abandoned, seen as backward, inefficient, or simply unfashionable. Today, only experimental farms grow them in the north. Why did these wild grains vanish? The answer, as always, lies in convenience and control. With the rise of centralized farming, the Norse world gradually shifted toward high-yield cereal monocultures, barley, rye, oats. Wild and marginal grains were no longer worth the labor. Their irregularity, toughness, and unpredictability made them undesirable in the age of plowing and taxation. Moreover, the knowledge needed to process them, how to leach toxins, how to combine them with fat, how to ferment their bitterness, was not written down. It was oral, experiential, and feminized. When this knowledge line broke, the foods themselves disappeared. Today we eat only a sliver of the grains once known to humankind. But in Viking times, the grain bowl was far wider, filled with seeds of stone, fire, edge, and time. And yet, not all is lost. Archaeobotanists have recovered viable seeds of these ancient cereals. Foragers and permaculture enthusiasts are experimenting with growing knotgrass, goosefoot, and wild rye once again. The old methods, parching, fermenting, pit baking, are being relearned. In their rebirth, we may glimpse not just the flavors of the past, but a future less dependent on fragile monocultures, a world where resilience is diversity, and where even the most forgotten grain holds the promise of life. Because the Vikings did not thrive on what was easiest, they thrived on what was possible. Part 13: Sacred Herbs and the Vanishing Green Witches. There are no stone monuments to them, no runestones carved with their names. And yet, in Viking society, their presence was unmistakable, found in the smoke curling from a hearth, the bundles drying in rafters, the whisper of leaves crushed in worn palms. They were the Green Witches, not witches in the modern sense, not crones riding broomsticks or figures of fairy tale, but women, and occasionally men, who held the oldest wisdom of the land, the knowledge of sacred herbs, their seasons, their spirits, and their power. These herbalists, known in some Norse traditions as Lifkindig, medicine-wise, or Vulva, Cirrus, preserved a pharmacopoeia rooted in prehistory, one woven from observation, reverence, and lived necessity. Their herbs were not merely medicines. They were food, ritual, defense, and communion with forces unseen. Much of this knowledge vanished not by natural forgetting, but by erasure, suspicion, and scorn. The herbs themselves still grow, their roots buried in the same earth they once blessed, but their stories and the hands that tended them have faded from memory. Let us remember them now. We explored Angelica, Archangelica, earlier as food, but its sacred role among Norse herbalists ran far deeper. In Viking Age Iceland and northern Norway, Angelica was cultivated deliberately in herb gardens known as Lifjagardar, towering to 6 feet tall. Its hollow stems and fragrant umbels marked it as a plant of power. It was used to season stews. Yes, but also to treat respiratory ailments, digestive troubles, childbirth complications, and even mental disturbances. In some accounts, dried Angelica was burned in rituals to cleanse homes or call forth ancestral spirits. The Velva might chew its roots before prophecy. Children teethed on its stalks. Warriors carried pouches of its seeds for luck and endurance. The Catholic Church, after it spread in Scandinavia, attempted to sanctify Angelica, renaming it after the Archangel Michael. But the plant's original role was pagan, rooted in feminine hands and seasonal rites. Among the most mysterious Viking herbs was mugwort, Artemisia vulgaris, a bitter, silvery plant that grew along forest edges, paths, and burial mounds. Mugwort was associated with protection worn in pouches around the neck or tied into clothing to ward off spirits and illness. But it also had a darker gift, the power to alter dreams, loosen the tongue, and open the inner eye. In some folk traditions preserved in Swedish folkmall, mugwort tea was taken during midsummer to induce visions. The herb was placed under pillows to invite dreams of ancestors or lost lovers. For the Velva, mugwort smoke was part of Sather, the trance divination practice through which hidden knowledge was revealed. Christian authorities denounced mugwort as a witch's herb by the 13th century. Its use continued in rural areas, but was stripped of its sacred framing. What once opened the doors of perception was now seen as dangerous curiosity. Not all sacred herbs worked through vision. Some worked through wound and bone, as steady and grounding as the women who gathered them. Bitoni, Stachys officinalis, and yarrow, Achillea millefolium, were 2 of the most trusted herbs in Viking medicine. Bitoni was known as the 30 healer, said to cure everything from head wounds to nightmares. Yarrow, with its feathery leaves and blood-staunching abilities, was battlefield medicine. These herbs were pounded into poultices, steeped into teas, or chewed fresh on long voyages. They also held ritual value. Betony wreaths were placed on the heads of the dying. Yarrow was burned in the birthing room to ease pain and protect mother and child. To the Lifkindig, these herbs were not just tools. They were allies, spirits to be approached with offering, song, and respect. Some herbs were feared even in their time. Hemlock, Conium maculatum, and Datura stramonium, are among the most toxic plants in Europe. Yet both appear in the archaeological and ethnobotanical record of Viking lands not as food, but as instruments of boundary crossing. In small, controlled doses, these plants induce visions, disorientation, and euphoria. They were sometimes used in ritual poisonings, ordeals, or vision quests likely overseen by experienced volur or shamans. The danger was understood. So was the power. One Icelandic folk tale, recorded in the 17th century but believed to echo pre-Christian roots, tells of a sleep herb given to warriors before their first raid. The herb induced a vision of death. Those who returned were seen as favored by the gods. Such practices were eventually outlawed and demonized. Hemlock became the archetypal witch's poison, Datura, the devil's trumpet, but they had been in the herbalist's hand long before the devil had a name. Who were these herbalists? Some were wives of farmers, skilled in cooking, healing, and childbirth. Others were volur, semi-nomadic seeresses who traveled between settlements performing divination, healing, and magical rites. Some were midwives, some elders, some quiet gatherers of plants who knew where the wild thyme grew best, when to harvest nettles, how to dry celandine so its power would not turn against the user. They lived at the edge of fields, in longhouses, but often apart, a respected but liminal caste. When Christianity spread, many of these women were tolerated at first. Their knowledge was too valuable to lose overnight. But by the 13th century, herbal medicine was being consolidated under monastic control, and non-Christian or unregulated practitioners were increasingly viewed with suspicion. By the 15th century, green witch had become a term of accusation. Burnings, exiles, silences followed. The gardens went untended. The herbs grew wild again, not honored, but forgotten. Today, the sacred herbs of the Norse are seen as weeds, curiosities, or symbols of folklore. Their uses are scattered in old texts, preserved in folk medicine, or revived in modern herbalism. But the living tradition of the Lifkindage, the green witches, was broken, and yet the herbs remain. Yarrow still blooms at midsummer. Mugwort still lines the paths. Angelica rises tall beside mountain streams, humming with bees. And as our world looks again to natural medicine, ancestral foods, and forgotten plant wisdom, the garden of the Norse may begin to bloom, once more not as fantasy, but as inheritance. Because to the Vikings, food and medicine were not separate, nor were plants and people. There was no wild, only kin. Part 14. Salt from the earth, the vanished mineral diet of the North. In the Viking Age, few substances were more vital or more elusive than salt. To preserve meat through long winters, to flavor roots and grains, to support life at the cellular level, salt was not a luxury, it was a lifeline. And yet, unlike fertile soil or fresh water, it could not always be farmed or fetched. It had to be gathered, traded, or extracted through effort that bordered on ritual. Modern palates take salt for granted, a flavor enhancer in a factory-sealed shaker. But in the Norse world, salt was a craft, an obsession, and at times, a scarcity. Without it, food spoiled, bodies weakened, societies withered, and so, Viking communities across Scandinavia developed a range of ingenious and now forgotten methods to harvest and preserve salt. These methods drew not only from the sea, but from earth, ashes, and even sacrifice. This is the lost story of the Viking mineral diet, how they salted a world before salt was cheap, and why much of that knowledge has turned to dust. On the western shores of Norway and the southern reaches of Denmark, the sea provided a natural, though unpredictable, supply of salt. Salt water was collected in shallow clay pans and left to evaporate in the sun or above fire. This process was labor-intensive and slow. On cloudy days, the salt would not crystallize. On rainy days, it dissolved. Yet some communities maintained salt pans year-round, feeding the brine into hollowed-out stones or clay basins, sealed with peat and lined with moss. The resulting sea salt was dark, gritty, and full of minerals, not pure but potent. It was packed into seal bladders or wool sacks and stored in cool, dry cellars. More than flavor, salt served as currency. Viking traders exchanged salt for furs, iron, and grain. In some markets, a bag of salt could fetch the same price as a small axe. Salt was so precious that it was occasionally stolen, and such thefts are recorded in early Icelandic legal codes, where salt robbery was punished with fines or exile. Inland, far from the reach of the tides, Norse farmers turned to a more secret method of salt making: ash extraction. Certain plants, particularly marsh grasses, ferns, and birchwood, store salt and alkaline minerals in their tissues. When burned in specific conditions, these plants yield ash rich in potassium, sodium, and chloride compounds. Vikings in forested regions developed the skill of creating salt ash lye, a liquid used to cure meats, tan hides, and preserve fish. The process was simple in theory, but precise in practice. 1. Birch or alder wood was burned in large pits. 2. The ash was collected and sifted to remove charcoal. 3. Water was poured over the ash and filtered through wool or moss. 4. The resulting lye was boiled until crystallized minerals formed on the pot's sides. 5. These crystals, a mix of salts and alkaline compounds, were scraped off and used as salt substitutes. Though not as clean as sea salt, ash salt was vital for inland communities. It kept food from rotting, it added flavor to otherwise bland gruels, and it may have been used in ritual purification, rubbed onto the skin before burial or childbirth. But it was also tied to fire, a double-edged gift. The same forests that gave salt could be stripped bare. The same flames that preserved meat could burn homes. This was a knowledge wielded with care and fear. Some of the most taboo forms of Viking salt came not from wood or water, but from bone. After a blot sacrifice, the ritual killing of animals to honor the gods, the remains were burned. Among the ashes of hoof, horn, and sinew, a rare white ash remained. When carefully sifted and washed, this ash produced bone salt, a form of calcium phosphate and sodium residue. This mineral was not used casually. It flavored special foods prepared during seasonal rites or funerals, meals eaten not for pleasure, but for communion with the dead. Bone salt symbolized a closed cycle, from beast to fire, from ash to body. The consumption of such salt likely had a spiritual dimension. It invoked the ancestors. It honored the sacrifice. It reminded those who ate that every flavor comes with a cost. This practice, like many tied to animal remains and fire, was condemned by the Church, first as unclean, then as diabolical. By the 13th century, bone ash use had all but disappeared from culinary records. Though rare, natural salt deposits did exist in parts of the Viking world, particularly along riverbanks in what is now northern Germany and Poland. From these sites, rock salt was mined in small quantities by hand, often using stone tools or primitive chisels. These salt blocks were brittle, mineral-rich, and precious. Caravans transported them northward via overland routes, eventually making their way into elite households and trading ports like Hedeby and Birka. To own rock salt was to declare one's power and prestige. It was carved into offerings, used in bride price negotiations, and sprinkled over sacred fires. In some regions, it was believed to repel evil spirits, especially when mixed with iron filings or bound into protective amulets. Yet the knowledge of where these salt veins lay and how to safely harvest them was localized and jealously guarded. When those communities fell or converted, The sites were forgotten, buried beneath peat, or reabsorbed into the forest. With time, the Norse mineral diet fell under siege. As Christian food laws spread, salt work tied to fire, bone, and ash was labeled unclean. Centralized salt production from southern Europe flooded the market with cheaper, standardized salt. Local traditions became obsolete or forbidden. The death knell came with industrial salt refining in the 18th century. Pure white salt became the standard. Ashy, mineral, rich, spiritually charged salts were relegated to peasant lore and then silence. We lost not only flavors but a relationship to land, to fire, to the sacred process of preservation. But salt endures. Even today, among Arctic and forest-dwelling descendants of the Norse, there are whispers of ash salt. Some Sami elders remember lye from birch ash used in cooking. In Iceland, sea salt is being revived from ancient pans near the black sand shores. Bone ash is studied by archaeologists as a clue to sacred meals. Salt was never just sodium, it was presence. It was binding between the living and the dead, between food and fire, between the seasons that take and the ones that give. To eat Viking salt was to eat history, and perhaps to taste it again we must once more gather water in clay bowls and listen as it boils into silence. Part 15. The Forbidden Mead, Lost Brews of the Pagan North. Before the beer halls and barley ales, before wine from the south reached northern shores, there was a drink older than gods, older than language, a drink born not of fields, but of forests. It was called mead, a fermentation of honey, water, and wild yeast. Mead was the first true alcohol of the Norse world, and for centuries, it was the most sacred. Not merely a beverage, it was an offering, a divination aid, and a conduit between mortal and divine. It was consumed in longhouses to honor kin, in temples to invoke gods, and in burial rites to send the dead toward their next world. But not all mead was the same. Some brews were forbidden, tied to pagan rituals, laced with hallucinogenic herbs or sacred mushrooms. These were drinks of ecstasy, prophecy, and power. And as Christianity spread, they became targets of suspicion, suppression, and oblivion. This is the story of the lost meads of the Viking Age, the ones too wild, too sacred, or too strange to survive history's purification. In Norse mythology, mead holds primordial significance. The legendary mead of poetry, a sacred brew made from the blood of the wise god Kvasir, granted those who drank it the power of eloquence, inspiration, and magic. Odin, chief of the Aesir, is said to have stolen this mead from the giants, transforming into an eagle to carry it back to the realm of gods. This story, preserved in the Skaldska Parmal of Snorri Sturluson, reflects more than myth. It encodes a cultural truth. That mead was not just a drink, but a means to touch the divine. Its intoxication wasn't escapism, it was enlightenment. And so, in the Viking world, mead took on ceremonial dimensions. It was brewed with care, consumed with intent, and dedicated to the gods with offerings and incantations. But not all mead was shared in the open. Some was brewed in secret, for rituals now lost to history. Traditional Norse mead was raw fermented, using only natural yeasts found in honeycomb, herbs, and wooden vessels. No sterilization, no standardization. Every batch was unique, a reflection of the season, the land, and the brewer's hand. Many meads were enhanced with botanicals, herbs added for flavor, preservation, or altered consciousness. Archaeological and literary evidence suggests the use of bog myrtle, myrica gale, a bitter aromatic with mild narcotic properties, juniper berries, antimicrobial, and piney, used for purification. Henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, a toxic but powerful hallucinogen when used in small amounts. Yarrow, Achillea millefolium, used to increase fermentation and induce vivid dreams. Angelica, to stabilize the brew and protect from spoilage. These brews were not consumed daily. They were ritual drinks, reserved for seether ceremonies, funerals, seasonal transitions, or warrior initiations. To drink them was to cross a threshold. One of the most mysterious meads was that used by the Velva, the Norse seeress. Before entering trance, the Velva would be seated high upon a platform, wrapped in a heavy cloak, surrounded by attendants singing the Vardlokur, a haunting chant meant to call spirits. In some accounts, she was offered a bitter brew before prophecy, a drink steeped with the root and the flower, thick and dark, poured from a horn. This was not festive mead. It was entheogenic, a substance to dissolve boundaries between self and world, living and dead. The herbs used are not known for certain, but traditions suggest henbane, datura, or even fly agaric mushrooms may have been involved, carefully prepared to avoid toxicity while opening the gates of vision. Such brews would later be forbidden, labeled sorcery by Christian authorities. But to the Norse, they were bridges to the other world. Among the most poignant uses of mead was in burial rites. When a Viking died, especially a chieftain or elder, mead was prepared and served during the funeral feast. Erfi. This was no celebration, but a ritual of succession and mourning. Drinking mead in this context was communal, symbolic, and binding. In some cases, mead was poured onto the grave as an offering. In others, a sealed jug was buried with the deceased, perhaps as nourishment for the journey to Hell or Valhalla. Chemical analysis of pottery from burial mounds in Norway and Denmark has revealed residue consistent with fermented honey drinks, often mixed with herbs and berry traces, elderberry, bilberry, and rowan. Such burial meads were considered sacred. To drink them outside their purpose was taboo, and yet, as the old gods fell, so too did this reverence. As Christianity swept across Scandinavia, mead was slowly stripped of its ritual meaning. The church feared its pagan associations, especially when linked to prophecy, altered states, or sacrifices. Herbs like henbane and mugwort were outlawed or branded as demonic. Women who brewed herbal mead, especially those tied to old rites, faced suspicion, exile, or worse. By the 13th century, mead remained popular as a secular drink, but its spiritual depth had been flattened. It was served at weddings and banquets, but no longer at rituals. Its ingredients were standardized. Its wildness was domesticated. The forbidden meads, those brewed for the Velva, the gods, or the ancestors, disappeared from written record, and with them, an entire way of understanding drink as transformation. In recent decades, artisans and historians have begun to revive ancient meads, not the sanitized versions, but the deep, herbal, raw fermentations of old. Experimental brewers in Iceland, Norway, and Britain are recreating meads using wild yeast, foraged herbs, and unfiltered honey. Some attempt to mirror the Velva's brews, carefully incorporating psychoactive herbs under controlled conditions for research. These modern efforts are more than curiosity. They're acts of resurrection, efforts to taste what the Norse once drank when they sang to gods, spoke to spirits, and prepared their dead for journeys across the sea of stars. The forbidden meads of the Norse were not forgotten because they were useless. They were forgotten because they were powerful. They bypassed gatekeepers. They offered connection without intercession. They allowed the farmer, the widow, the Velva, to speak with worlds beyond the visible. In reviving these meads, we do more than ferment honey. We remember a time when food and drink were sacred acts, when a cup could contain a story, a prayer, a world. And in lifting that cup again, perhaps we lift more than memory. Perhaps we lift the veil. Part 16. The lost oils, forgotten fats that kept the Vikings alive. In the cold, wind-flayed landscapes of the Norse world, there was no room for vanity in food. Calories were currency. Fat was life. Forget olive oil, coconut, or sunflower. The Viking world knew none of these. Instead, their survival depended on animal and wild plant fats, thick, pungent, slow-burning energy sources that fed both body and fire. These were the lost oils, the rendered tallow, bone grease, fish liver drippings, and obscure plant-based oils that kept the Norse strong through the frozen dark. They were laborious to extract, difficult to store, and often spiritually charged. Today, most are gone scorned as primitive, unhealthy, or unclean. But without these fats, the Viking world would not have endured. Grain and meat alone could not sustain warriors, mothers, farmers, or sailors. They needed fat to cook, preserve, and fuel their daily toil, and what they used would shock the modern tongue. Among the coastal peoples of northern Norway, Iceland, and Greenland, seal fat was a cornerstone of survival. Harvested from ringed and harp seals, this thick white fat was rendered into oil through slow boiling or direct heating over stone. Once liquefied, it was stored in skins or pottery, sometimes flavored with dried herbs or seaweed. Seal fat had a low freezing point and remained malleable even in deep cold. It was smeared on bread, used to fry dried fish, mixed into barley porridge, or consumed raw in small spoonfuls during long voyages. Children were taught from an early age to respect it. A spoonful could keep one alive for hours in the snow. It also had ritual use. Some burial sites contained traces of seal oil in bowls left beside the dead. In other cases, seal oil was burned as fuel in stone lamps, casting light during winter feasts or rites for the ancestors. The Norse were intimately tied to the sea, and with that came a resource both revered and reviled: fish liver oil. Livers from cod, haddock, and halibut were fermented or gently heated, allowing their golden oils to separate and rise. The resulting substance was stored in tightly sealed containers, often mixed with herbs or stored in bladders to prevent oxidation. The taste, intensely bitter, metallic, almost intolerable by modern standards, but the nutritional power of fish liver oil, rich in vitamin D, A, and omega-3s, made it a sacred tonic. In winter, when the sun vanished for months, this oil kept bones strong, skin supple, and eyes sharp. Some traditions reserved fish liver oil for children, the sick, and pregnant women. In others, warriors drank it before long raids, believing it would sharpen sight and stamina. Though still made in parts of Norway today, its ancient ceremonial and survival role has faded, replaced by capsules, pills, and clinical packaging. Inland, where access to sea fat was scarce, Viking households turned to bone grease fat rendered from marrow bones and spongy joints of large animals. After slaughter, bones were crushed with hammers and boiled in stone pots over low fire for hours. The fat that rose was skimmed, strained, and stored in wooden tubs. Often, this was done after all meat had been eaten, a final harvest of the animal's essence. Bone grease was highly valued. It was mixed with grains to form portable rations, smeared on bread, or used to preserve small meat pieces in jars sealed with fat, the Viking equivalent of pemmican. It also had symbolic value. Some runestones depict bones being broken not in violence, but in ritual. The act of extracting fat from bone may have been seen as drawing life from death, an echo of the myth where Odin drinks from the well of memory. Among northern hunters, the fat of the bear was considered exceptional soft, abundant, and long-lasting. Bears were not regular game. They were hunted selectively, often ritually, and with deep spiritual precautions. To kill a bear was to offend a spirit, unless one performed proper rites. But if the animal was slain with honor, its fat was seen as medicine and magic. Bear fat was rubbed on wounds, fed to the weak, and used in rituals of transformation, especially for berserkers, the trance-fighting warriors who may have sought strength from the bear's essence. Its consumption was later outlawed under Christian influence. To eat bear fat, especially ritually, was branded as pagan, even demonic. By the 14th century, the knowledge of rendering and using bear grease had all but vanished from the north. It may sound improbable, but Vikings in wetland regions knew how to extract fat-like substances from certain marsh plants and seeds. One such source was yellow water lily seeds, which contain a sticky, oily pulp when ground and boiled. In desperate times, this paste was dried and stored like lard, used in porridges or spread on flatbread. Another strange find is the so-called bog butter blocks of fat, discovered buried in peat bogs across Ireland and Scotland, with a few samples found in Norse, settled Orkney and Hebrides. Some theorize this was dairy butter preserved in anaerobic conditions, while others suggest it was animal fat infused with herbs and sealed in bogs to age or sanctify it. Regardless, the use of wetland environments to store and alter fats shows a culinary ingenuity now completely lost. The decline of these fats came slowly through cultural shame, religious condemnation, and the rise of industrial oils. As butter, olive oil, and lard became standardized, the older fats, fishy, gamey, unrefined, were discarded. Even in modern Scandinavia, children are rarely taught the fat lore of their ancestors. Seal oil is stigmatized. Bear fat is illegal. Bone grease is forgotten. And the spiritual context that once imbued these fats with meaning, their connection to kin, land, and death, is nowhere to be found. Yet the archaeological record remains. Grease stains in pots, lipid residues on blades, ancient recipes inscribed not in ink, but in fire and stone. Modern science now confirms what the Vikings knew intuitively. Traditional fats were medicinal. They nourished the brain, supported fertility, protected against cold and disease. They didn't come easy, every drop was earned, but in their scarcity lay their reverence. To reclaim these fats is not just to change a diet, it is to change a worldview, one where nothing is wasted, one where food carries memory, one where survival isn't sterile, it's sacred. Part 17. Foraged breads, the vanishing art of baking without fields. In the heart of a Viking forest, far from the open fields and plowed furrows of settled land, smoke curls upward from a stone hearth. Inside a low, turf-roofed shelter, a woman crouches over a flat, heated rock. She flips a small cake with a bone spatula, dark, dense, and steaming, its aroma thick with moss, ash, and earth. This is not wheat bread, not even barley. This is foraged bread made from crushed acorns, wild seeds, dried lichen, and the bitter flour of forest tubers. A bread without grain, born not from agriculture but from the wild itself. In the Viking world, bread wasn't just what came from fields. It was what could be gathered, ground, fermented, and baked anywhere, by anyone. When harvests failed or fields were lost to frost, it was this tradition that kept people alive, the forgotten art of wild baking. Today, it is all but lost, but buried in soil, sagas, and the memory of stone ovens, its ashes still speak. Contrary to modern assumptions, wheat was rare in most of Viking Age Scandinavia. The cold, acidic soils of the north were better suited to barley and rye, and even those grains were vulnerable to rot, frost, and hail. And so, the Norse did what all resilient cultures do. They adapted. They created breads without cultivated grain, using wild plants, nuts, mosses, and even bone meal to stretch or replace flour. These were not delicate loaves. They were flatbreads, ash cakes, and porridge pats, dense, smoky, sustaining, baked on hot stones, in embers, or on iron pans. They were shaped by fire and hand, not yeast or perfection. One of the most important ingredients in wild bread was the acorn, the nut of the oak tree, abundant throughout parts of southern Norway, Denmark, and the Baltic coast. Viking women collected acorns in autumn, storing them in woven baskets to dry. Before they could be eaten, acorns had to be leached, soaked repeatedly in cold or warm water to remove bitter tannins. This process could take days, sometimes weeks. Once leached, the acorns were dried again, ground on stone querns, and sifted into a fine, nutty flour. Acorn bread was mixed with animal fat, sour milk, or fermented berries. Sometimes it was fried in bear grease. Other times it was baked under ash, wrapped in birch bark. Its texture was coarse, but its flavor was earthy and rich, a memory of the forest in every bite. And yet, when wheat and barley became more available, acorn flour was deemed poor man's food. Its long preparation and association with hunger consigned it to history. In desperate times, even acorns were too rich. Enter the world of lichen bread made from reindeer moss, Cladonia rangiferina, or Iceland moss, Citraria islandica, both of which could be ground and mixed with other starches to stretch a meager supply of grain. Lichen contains carbohydrates but is bitter and mildly toxic unless properly treated. Viking herbalists boiled it with ash water or sour whey to neutralize its acids. The resulting pulp was dried and combined with fish meal or root flour, then baked flat over fire. Though bland and spongy, these famine loaves were life-saving. A similar method used pine bark flour, thin layers of soft cambium scraped from pine trees, dried, ground, and added to dough. In parts of Sweden, this tradition survived into the 19th century. Modern palates would find these breads harsh, but for the Norse, they were survival incarnate, the forest feeding its children in times of want. Some wild breads contain no flour at all. In highland regions, where even barley failed, Viking women grated wild roots, particularly skirwite, wild carrot, or even cattail tubers, and mashed them with hazelnuts or dried fish. This paste was shaped into small cakes, then dried in the sun or smoked over hearths. These root cakes were more like dense energy bars than bread, but they served the same purpose: portable, durable nourishment. Some were mixed with honey or dried berries for warriors on the move. Others were salted and kept for lean months. Perhaps the most widespread form of foraged bread was the ash cake, a dough of whatever could be found, flattened and baked directly in embers, then scraped clean of soot. These breads were made with crushed wild grains, knotgrass, goosefoot, fat or marrow, fermented whey, foraged herbs, nettles, sorrel, wild onion. The result was smoky, chewy, and sustaining. Some were cooked between stones, others on iron griddles. No two were alike, and no exact recipe survives. They were born from the moment, improvised from what the land offered. With the rise of agriculture, these wild baking traditions were slowly abandoned. Wheat, rye, and barley became state-sponsored grains tied to tithes, taxation, and central markets. Wild flowers, associated with poverty and famine, were stigmatized. Christian monks recorded recipes for proper bread, while banning or ignoring the older, earthier loaves. In time, baking became a specialized craft, not a survival skill, and when industrial milling began, flour lost its roots literally. Today, few remember how to leach an acorn, boil lichen, or grind pine bark into sustenance, but the forest remembers. In recent years, experimental archaeologists and foragers have begun recreating these breads, not as novelties, but as acts of cultural recovery. In Denmark, Lichen bread has been baked in reconstructed Viking ovens. In Norway, bark flour loaves are being tested for their prebiotic value. In Iceland, root cakes have reappeared in historical food festivals. What emerges is not just a new taste, but a new respect for resilience, for creativity, for the hands that turn nothing into nourishment. These were not desperate measures. They were deep knowledge, the kind we may need again. Part 18. Blood and Broth. The Vanishing, Liquid, Lifelines of the North. The longhouse is quiet in winter. Snow drifts against its thick wooden walls. Wind cries low through the trees. Inside, over the hearth, a pot bubbles dark, fragrant, alive with marrow and memory. This is not stew, not soup. This is broth, the lifeblood of Viking sustenance. And in it swims something deeper, the essence of bone, herb, and sometimes even blood itself. In the Norse world, broth wasn't a side dish. It was a core pillar of survival. Thin or thick, salted or sour, fresh or fermented, it carried nutrients, preserved calories, and warmed the spirit when the body began to falter. Alongside it stood another, far more taboo liquid, blood, harvested, cooked, thickened into cakes, or stirred into porridge. Animal blood was used with precision and reverence. In a world where waste meant death, no part of a kill was discarded, and blood was perhaps the most powerful of all. Yet over time, both these liquids, once revered, became marginalized, vilified, and finally forgotten. Viking broth was made daily. Unlike modern soups laden with vegetables and meat, Viking broths were often minimalist. Bones, fat, herbs, salt if available, and sometimes a few root vegetables like skirwite or parsnip. Left to simmer for hours over slow flame, they transformed into nutrient-rich elixirs. These broths weren't just for taste. They served vital roles. Bone broth fortified calcium and collagen during winter. Fish head broth provided omega oils and protein. Blood broth, when used, restored iron and vitality, especially after childbirth or illness. Some broths were fermented, stored in sealed pots, thickened with sour whey or grains, forming a kind of proto-soup that could last weeks in cold weather. In larger settlements, cauldrons were communal. The same pot might bubble for days, with new bones, herbs, or offal added as old ingredients were eaten. These were called perpetual broths, never-ending stews of sustenance. This communal pot sat at the center of the Norse world, warming, feeding, and bonding kin through harshest nights. To many modern ears, the idea of eating blood sounds unpalatable. But in Viking society, blood was not only food, it was medicine, ritual, and reverence. Collected during the slaughter of sheep, pigs, cattle, or seals, blood was mixed immediately with salt or vinegar to prevent clotting. It was then used in a range of preparations: blood porridge, blodgrot; blood thickened with barley flour or oats; blood cakes; pan, fried with onions, herbs, and fat; blood sausages, encased in intestines, boiled and stored for winter. But blood had meanings far beyond the culinary. It was tied to sacrifice and sacredness. During blot rituals, animal blood was sprinkled over statues, walls, and participants. In some burial sites, traces of blood and broth have been found near the head of the dead, suggesting it was consumed or offered during funeral rites. Blood was life, literally and symbolically. To waste it was not just foolish, it was profane. One of the most common blood dishes, now entirely forgotten, was blodgrot, or blood porridge. This thick, iron-rich meal was prepared in winter after the annual slaughter. Farmers' wives collected warm blood into wooden bowls, added barley meal or crushed roots, and stirred slowly over low fire until it thickened into a dark, rich pudding. It was flavored with salt, wild herbs, or even dried berries, eaten hot with sour cream or fat. It was a feast for the lean season dense with protein and calories. Some families passed down special ladles and bowls used only for blood porridge, believing the dish carried ancestral memory and protection. With the spread of Christianity, the use of blood, especially in food, was vigorously condemned. Blood foods were labeled unclean, even devilish. Church decrees forbade their use in feast days. Priests warned that consuming blood was inviting demonic spirits. Some regions outlawed it entirely by the 14th century. Broths, too, lost their sacred place. Once tied to the hearth, to mothers, to midwives, and herbalists, they became associated with poverty, a poor person's meal, a peasant's fallback. By the modern era, industrial stock cubes and canned soups replaced the slow, sacred broths of fire and bone. Blood dishes disappeared except in remote pockets of tradition, often mocked or hidden. A knowledge passed through generations of women and hunters, lost to shame and convenience. Despite their disappearance, these liquid foods have left traces. Carbonized potsherds soaked in lipids, spoons stained red from iron and marrow, saga references to a bowl of broth in the hall of mourning. Even modern nutritionists now recognize bone broth and blood as powerhouses of nourishment, rich in collagen, iron, amino acids, and micronutrients once abundant in ancestral diets. Some Nordic chefs have begun to revive them. Blothgrot has returned in experimental restaurants in Iceland. Fish head broth simmers again in Faroe Island kitchens. The cauldron, once a symbol of power, family, and feminine wisdom, is making its quiet return. In lifting a spoonful of broth or blood, the Vikings did not simply nourish the body. They invoked a relationship with animal, season, and story. Every sip was a remembering of the kill, of the land, of the cold that never ends, of the fire that never dies. And perhaps, in a world once again unsure of its future, we too might return to these vanished liquids, not out of desperation, but out of reverence. Because to eat blood and broth is not just to survive. It is to honor the ancient contract between hunger and humility, between the wild and the hearth, between the body and the bones of those who came before. Part 19. Fermented Roots and Sour Magic. The Viking Art of Gut Survival. When snow lay deep on the ground and the earth turned hard as iron, the Norse stomach had to change. In a world without refrigeration, where root cellars could only stretch so far, survival depended on an ancient craft, one both practical and magical: fermentation. To the Vikings, fermentation was not just a method, it was a transformation. A raw root became a living food. A bitter stalk became a tangy preserve. What began as decay ended as life. They fermented not only meat and dairy, but also vegetables, roots, and even herbs, storing the sunlit bounty of summer in clay pots, buried beneath turf, or tucked into the cold corners of the longhouse. These sour foods weren't just for hunger. They supported digestion, preserved nutrients, and strengthened the immune system during the dark months when illness stalked like a wolf. But with time, these sour magics, once central to Viking health, vanished from memory, dismissed as peasant food, rotted beyond redemption. Now, we remember. Viking Age fermentation wasn't written down. It was passed from hands to hands, mother to daughter, farmer to healer. The most commonly fermented foods included turnips nepa, wild carrots, Angelica roots, cabbage-like greens, sea kale and salt-tolerant herbs. These roots and stalks were grated, sliced, or crushed, then packed with salt into ceramic or wooden vessels. Sometimes, whey or fermented barley water was added to kickstart the process. Lids were weighted with stones or sealed with animal bladders. The pots were then stored underground, beneath snow, or inside the cold, dark corners of the longhouse. After days or weeks, a transformation began. The food soured, softened, fizzed with quiet life. The Vikings didn't know the word for lactobacillus, but they knew this: sour food was strong food. Among the most important fermented plants was Angelica, Archangelica, a tall, aromatic herb prized for its medicinal and spiritual properties. The stalks and roots of Angelica were sliced and pickled in brine, fermented with whey, sometimes dried and later rehydrated in sour liquids. This created a tangy, slightly sweet food that was antimicrobial, digestive, and believed to ward off illness. Some burial sites in Iceland show traces of fermented Angelica in grave offerings, suggesting it was not only food, but ritual nourishment for the journey to the afterlife. In modern times, Angelica survives only as a candied garnish. Its Viking life, as sour, sacred medicine, is nearly forgotten. Before cabbage dominated northern Europe, turnips were king. Their thick skins and earthy flesh made them ideal for cold storage and souring. Turnips were grated or sliced, layered with salt and sometimes herbs, packed into sealed barrels or buried clay pots, left to ferment in the cold for weeks or months. The result was a pungent, crunchy food, similar to sauerkraut, but stronger, darker, and more fibrous. These sour turnips were eaten with fatty meats, spread on bread, or stirred into broth. They provided not only flavor, but vital gut bacteria, long before such things were understood. They kept digestion steady, reduced spoilage, and offered a rare winter freshness when all else had turned to rot. Whey, the liquid byproduct of sour milk or cheese, was itself a powerful fermenter. Vikings used soured whey to preserve vegetables, create drinks called surmjölk, sour milk, enhance the shelf life of cooked roots, sterilize clay vessels. In some accounts, fermented turnip and sour milk were combined into a thick, tangy mash eaten by elders, pregnant women, or warriors recovering from illness. The lactic acid in whey not only preserved food, but protected the gut, especially during periods of intense physical stress. To ferment was not merely to preserve, it was to invite invisible forces, spirits of transformation, ancestors in the pot. Some fermenting vessels were marked with runes or carved animal symbols. Others were ritually sealed with smoke or herbs to protect the contents from unquiet dead or illness bringers. In parts of Iceland and Greenland, fermented foods were brought to seasonal feasts or sacrificial blots, not as main dishes, but as sacred offerings, their sourness seen as a proof of age and power. There was even a belief that eating too much unblessed fermented food could cause madness or dream sickness, not because of spoilage, but because the spirits within the pot had not been properly honored. As Christian foodways spread, fermentation became suspect. Soured milk, pickled herbs, and root mash were increasingly seen as improper, even unhygienic. Bread rose with yeast now. Meat was salted, not soured. Fermented roots, once sacred survival, became food for peasants, then for no one. Add to this the industrialization of food refrigeration, pasteurization, sterilization, and the living cultures of Viking fermentation were killed. What remained were ghosts. Today, scientists and chefs alike are rediscovering the microbial wealth of fermented root foods. Lactic fermentation preserves vitamin C and creates bioavailable nutrients. Fermented turnips contain gut-supporting probiotics similar to kimchi. Angelica fermentation is being explored as a treatment for digestive inflammation. In Scandinavia, foragers and experimental cooks are reviving old recipes, turning whey-soaked turnips and sour herb mash into gourmet dishes. But this is not innovation, it is remembrance. In the dark months, when all fresh food vanished, it was the sour things that survived. Tangy, pungent, slightly fizzy, they carried life forward. They fed not just the gut, but the memory of green seasons, of hands that knew the forest, of stone jars in the earth still bubbling. Fermentation is patience. Fermentation is trust. And for the Vikings, it was a kind of quiet magic, one now rising again, from pot to plate, from silence to song. Part 20. The Feast of the Forgotten. How these foods vanished, and what they can teach us. The fire has burned low, the pot is empty. The stories are told. All that remains are echoes, the aftertastes of another world. In this final part, we return to the question that lingers beneath every vanished recipe, every sacred broth, every blood sausage, root mash, and sour herb. Why did these foods disappear? Not from lack of value, not from poor nutrition, but from forgetting and from something far more deliberate: erasure. The Viking diet wasn't just a collection of strange dishes. It was a worldview, one built on respect for death, reverence for waste, and intimacy with wildness. It carried ancient contracts between people, land, and time. And when a new world came, with new gods and new powers, it demanded something bold, a cleansing of memory. What was once sacred became taboo. What was once survival became poverty. What was once holy became heathen. This is the tale of how Viking food, real Viking food, vanished, and why, today, it must be remembered. When Christianity swept across Scandinavia, it did not arrive only with crosses and preachers. It brought bread risen, white, and pure. It brought wine consecrated, foreign, and sacred. It brought rules Levitical and Roman about what could and could not be eaten. Among the first targets were blood foods. Priests declared the consumption of blood a sin, an echo of Jewish dietary laws repurposed for ecclesiastical control. They condemned blot feasts, where blood broth, seal meat, and bear fat were shared in honor of the gods. They outlawed fermented pagan meads and root-based rituals of the Velva. To convert the stomach was to convert the soul. By changing how a people ate, the church changed how they lived and who they believed themselves to be. As Christianity spread, so too did agrarian expansion. Forest lands were cleared, fields expanded. Monastic farms became the norm. Crops like wheat, rye, and oats grown in rows, taxed in bushels, replaced wild harvested herbs, moss, and roots. Foraging, once seen as noble survival, became associated with the poor. The acorn flour and pine bark cakes of the past became symbols of desperation, not tradition. Ash cakes and fermented root mash were no longer sacred but embarrassing. Knowledge once passed down in song and hand was now left to wither. Elders died. Pots cracked. The fermentation vessels were buried, literally and figuratively. The modern world killed the last flame. Refrigeration made preservation passive. Sterilization turned living foods into dead calories. White bread, pasteurized milk, refined oils, the new symbols of progress, offered convenience, but severed connection. Who needs seal oil when margarine can be shipped from across the sea? Why collect lichen when canned peas are cheaper? This wasn't simply a shift in diet. It was the collapse of a relationship between food and fire, food and season, food and death. Viking food was earned, not bought. It was a negotiation with the world. When that world was paved over, the foods vanished. In losing the foods of the Viking Age, we lost more than recipes. We lost resilience, a knowledge of survival without imports, electricity, or endless abundance. Sacredness, a sense that food could be part of worship, ritual, and mourning. Sustainability, low, waste systems that used every part of the animal and plant. Microbial wisdom, rich, living foods that supported health before modern science could name probiotics or omega-3s. Intergenerational memory, knowledge passed not in books but in gestures, stories, seasons. To eat like a Viking was to live with awareness of death, of scarcity, of the sacred. That is what we lost. Now, in the 21st century, we face a paradox. We have more food than ever, but less nourishment. More convenience, but less memory. More science, but less tradition. And so the old Viking foods, these forgotten, fermented, blooded, sour, sacred things, whisper again. They remind us that food is not just fuel, it is story, it is medicine, it is ritual. And in remembering how the Vikings ate, we remember how they endured, how they turned root and bone, fungus and blood, into a feast for survival. Imagine for a moment a long table in the Hall of the Dead. Upon it, a pot of bone broth slow simmered over pine, blood sausage, dark and glistening with barley and herbs, seal fat spread on sour turnip bread, mead infused with mugwort and wild Angelica, acorn cakes, fried in bear grease, stacked high beside lichen pickles, fermented skirwite mash tart and alive, a jug of soured whey sealed with bark, and a bowl just one of blood porridge, thick and steaming, offered to the ancestors. This is not a museum exhibit. This is home. This is what once was, and what could be again if we choose to remember. The foods of the Vikings were not perfect. They were harsh, bitter, slow, but they were real. They were earned, and they were theirs. In reclaiming these foods, or even just honoring their memory, we reclaim something more, a way of seeing the world not as an endless market, but as a sacred negotiation, where every kill is respected, where every scrap has value, where nothing is wasted, not even the past. So light the fire, boil the pot, remember the root, ferment the future, and welcome back to the table, the feast of the forgotten,